Hello and welcome to today's GC Advantage webinar. My name is Bob Barker. I'm one of the founders of BarkerGilmore, and today's topic is something that everybody loves to talk about: compensation, specifically equity compensation, everything from whether you're working at a startup to public companies. Just to, I guess, timing wise, it's interesting that this week we're releasing our in-house counsel compensation report. Over 3,700 of you, that many of you probably that are participating today contributed to that, so thank you. And there's some major enhancements we made to the report this year, in that we've always included the median, which is kind of the midpoint of compensation for different positions, and whether it's public, private, or private equity portfolio companies. And this year we also included the quartiles and that information, so that you can really see, where whether it's yours or your organization's numbers come out as far as kind of in the lower range, the middle, or the upper range of compensation. So look forward to getting that information soon. And for those who may not be familiar with us, BarkerGilmore, an executive search firm. We also provide coaching and advising, such as Jamey Seely, who's presenting, hosting today's event, will be as an example. She's been helping a number of clients as they develop and grow in their role, as well as their overall function. As far as the GC Advantage program, it's a complimentary professional development program, and it's an opportunity to hear from other GCs, such as we have today. Sometimes we have CEOs, board members, and so it's just a way to learn from others and gain some insight to help advance your career. So hopefully you find it valuable. Today's event will be recorded. You will get notified with an email. We're going to make it available, so as a video, but also as a podcast. So again, we'll let you know as soon as that is posted. We have many upcoming webinars. The next one is going to be about effectively working with boards. So that's going to be in June. So look forward to that event. Hopefully you can attend. And then just as far as questions, please submit your questions through the Zoom application. You'll see a little Q&A icon, usually at the bottom of the screen. And we'll do our best to answer your questions, whether it's through the event as well as at the end of the event. We'll do our best to answer all of them. And if you see a question that's similar to one you have, feel free to use the thumbs up icon, which would just indicate that this is a very popular question, and that'll help push it to the top of the list. With this, I will turn it over to Jamey, and I'll go dark for the majority of the session today, and then I'll come back at the end. So Jamey, thank you very much, and I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Bob. Appreciate the introduction. I'm Jamey Seely, as Bob mentioned. I'm a senior advisor with BarkerGilmore as part of BarkerGilmore's coaching program. So if you have any questions about that, please reach out to Bob or to me after the session. We're always glad to help. So today we're going to be talking about equity compensation, and it's going to be from public to private. And I've got two great panelists here to help me with that, who've both had experience on both sides of the ledger. So Melanie, would you like to introduce yourself first?
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Melanie Margolin. I'm the Chief Legal Officer for Clarivate. We are a transformational information services company. I have multiple functions there. So I have privacy and sustainability. The chief risk officer reports into me. It's a really fun, fulsome role. And I dive into quite a bit there with the board on the corporate governance side. Before this, I was at a private company that had about 1,200 folks in it. And I was the chief legal officer there as well. And then the last relevant piece of experience I have is while my company is about a 4 or 5 billion in market cap company, I was the deputy general counsel for a $40 billion company. And so I've gotten some experience in how the really big companies do it as well. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation, Jamey. Thanks for having me.
Thanks. Great. All right, Tricia, how about giving a little intro before we get started?
Thanks, Jamey and Melanie. I'm Tricia Elias. I'm the Chief People and Culture Officer at Vantage Data Centers. We're a global hyperscale data center provider. Before turning to the HR side of the house, I was Chief Legal Officer at a publicly traded company, then known as ServiceSource, now has been acquired by Concentrix. So I have a little bit of exposure to the equity side of the house on both the private and public company side, and looking forward to participating today. Back over to you, Jamey.
Okay, thanks. All right, well, let's jump right in and let's start at the beginning. So when I say let's start at the beginning, let's start talking about ISOs versus RSUs. And to set the stage a little bit, I think, you know, when you start as a small private company, everybody starts with ISOs. It's pretty easy. You know, usually the price is about $1, and you know, nobody gets really fussed about it. But then at a certain point, you start growing, and the price starts growing, and you start getting these questions of, you know, affordability around those ISOs, and where do you go next once you have that? So I think that's where we really wanted to start, and with those issues of when and how do you manage it. And Melanie, I know you've had some interesting structures that you've seen at some of your companies. Maybe you want to start by maybe talking about how you guys kind of manage the transition from, you know, mostly ISOs to RSUs.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, when I was first in-house legal, it was at a public company, and I watched us transition from, you know, options and RSUs to more performance shares than options. And so while I wasn't a decision maker in that, it was very interesting to sort of live and learn through that, because that's one of the things I think that public companies can consider, whether to do options, performance shares, and RSUs, or just options and RSUs, or some combination of that. The company I just read, actually, the annual report for the company I first was in-house with, which is Cummins, and I had forgotten actually that they also did performance cash. And so I know we're not talking about cash compensation, but you know, that program was pretty fulsome between the options, the performance shares, the performance cash, and then your base salary. I then went to a private company, and the company had just gone through a transition of moving from the options into giving RSUs. So the thing I always like to think about, and I'm no expert in this, right? I sort of inherited a system and then had to make adjustments that we'll talk about later today as a result of that. But the one thing I would really point out, and you mentioned it, is the timing of when. And I mean, my opinion is there isn't a moment in time that makes it the right time, but I do think it's important to think through very carefully with finance, with your chief people officer, from a legal perspective, what are the factors that make it the best time? And so I think the timing of going from options as the price raises and people can't actually afford them to RSUs draws several questions we are going to talk about, including sort of the double trigger and how that can make it difficult as well.
Yeah, I think those are great points, Melanie. I think the thing that, you know, I would add from my experience, because I joined Crusoe after being a public company GC in 3 different public companies. It was a really interesting issue for me. And, you know, it was our chief people officer and some other people who started to point out, hey, these option prices are getting bigger and they're getting more expensive. And that's becoming difficult for people who want to exercise them and hold and start getting their, long-term capital gains. And it's really, I think, a bit of an art versus a science question as to where that is. And I think it requires a lot of contact with, people outside of your own group to really figure out, okay, where are the pain points for people? Are we at that point yet? And how do we solve it? And, I think I came in and we came up with some novel solutions to it, because it does get challenging once you start moving from a scheme that doesn't have any tax implications, or at least, if it does, it only happens because you chose to exercise, which, is a choice, to schemes that, can potentially have tax implications, and, the way you avoid it and postpone them, I think, is super helpful. And I think that's something, Tricia, you want to jump in?
Oh, go ahead. I want you to finish your thought. And yes, I will after you're done.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think that's really a little bit of the art of it, is really, when do you, how do you push that tax implication off or help employees through it? Because it really is the thing that, everybody is thinking about and everybody has to deal with. And it is what really makes it hard versus, any other factor, is really just how do you deal with that element? And, maybe you guys could comment on how you've kind of dealt with those implications.
Sure. So to follow on what you were saying, Jamey, what the transition in a private company from options to RSUs is a lot of times depends, your ability to do it artfully depends on the level that we're talking about and the size of your business. If you're granting to leadership only, the likelihood, that you'll have a smaller sample size to train and have a conversation about tax implications with is higher, and that makes it easier to make that transition maybe earlier in the process. If you're granting to everybody and you have 1,000 employees, especially people who might not be as sophisticated in terms of tax consequences, that can really have a hit to employee morale, which is the exact opposite thing that you're looking for in making these equity grants. And I think many of you on this call may have lived through, like we did, the .com crash in the early aughts, which really, I think, prompted the transition on the public company side away from options when we saw value going away and some option backdating issues. So from a public company perspective, we've seen such an increase in values recently that I have sort of started to see some options sneaking back into the conversation. And I think, again, from an employee morale perspective, when value of an option is erased, it can be a lot harder to recover that from a morale perspective.
Yeah, that's a great point about whether or not you should even think about them, because it really, options are great as long as you're up, but the minute you take a downturn, right, no one likes the way they look, and it becomes really demoralizing depending on the level of downturn.
Could I add one thing to that, Jamey?
Yeah.
I think, as you mentioned, sort of having to work across the aisle and bring in our people and bring in finance, it isn't really a legal decision, but I think the morale piece of it is something we as leaders all carry. And even with RSUs in a private company, I found a cultural issue that I would never have expected as values go up and then back down. We were a company that granted to everyone. So, leaders received more options and RSUs, and we had transitioned to non-executives receiving just RSUs. But as the 409A value dropped for various factors, now you were granting RSUs using a dollar figure in some way tied to that. So new employees were getting RSUs in tranches with a different value than longstanding employees. And when that value went down, if we used that new 409A value, that wasn't equitable. And you had lots of arguments for doing it lots of different ways, but it wasn't something I had anticipated with the values actually changing even at a private company.
Yeah, it's a really great point, right? Because if you are in one of these seats long enough, right, you do go through the bumps, and even a couple of Tricia, you mentioned a really big event, but 2 years ago, 1 year ago, there really was a dip in equity investment and bids that people would make at it, and a lot of people just chose not to. But it did cause those 409As to dip, and it's hard because it's such a black box thing. I think I found that quite challenging. Like, how do you explain a 409A valuation? Well, it's you hire a third party, they give you you give them a bunch of data, and they spit out a number. And I think one of the things that we had to have was education throughout, our company, that this is, that's just a number that's given. It's not an indication of the company's health. It's not an indication of the company's trajectory. It's just a measurement number we use. And I think
Jamey, I'll just jump in real quick with a public service announcement. All of you who are thinking, oh yes, we did a training on that last year, and I'm sure everybody knows, yet they don't. So you've heard 7 different times, 7 different ways. That's thing one. Keep training even more than you think, because you explain this too much to me, said no one ever. So doing it, and then keep in mind, especially as your company grows, there are people who haven't heard the training. So the more complex it is, Jamey, loved your black box comment and would love to hear more about how you explain it, but keep at it.
Yeah, it's a great point about training, Tricia, because I think that's one of the things that we had to implement, especially as we, going back to the transition from ISO to RSU. People just had a lot of questions. They didn't understand it. You need to really just sort of help people kind of come up on the curve of, why are you giving me something new and different? I liked my old thing, I think. Maybe I like the new thing better. I don't really know. And that really, I think, was something that helped smooth it a lot. But like all trainings, you can't even catch everybody in one meeting, right? So it's multiple trainings within a year until people kind of sort of catch up and go from there. But I want to kind of maybe bring us back just a little bit to that transition piece, because Melanie, I know you guys kind of came up with some ways to deal with the tax implications and the difficulties of it with a double trigger. That's a fairly traditional way to do it, and maybe that's a good starting point to kind of talk through how that works, and then I can talk through some more novel ways. And they all have pluses and minuses, and there's no one formula, but you can at least talk through the different options so everyone sort of knows what cards they have to play.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'll share what we did. And to me, it was novel, but learning about it made me realize that there were lots of people in the industry at private companies who, and I was with Thumbtack, which has been around, I think, 14 years now, actually. And they're pretty late stage and very successful. And they had moved to RSUs when I got there, sort of in the ramp up to one day becoming public, and facing all of those issues with the options made it a good decision when they made the decision. What we found, though, is because the RSUs were double trigger, meaning you had to have a public company event. I mean, there were several others, but the most common is you would become public, and then those RSUs, were liquid. That was fine on that tranche of equity, but as the options became sort of what you would consider underwater in a public company, we were faced with all the employee morale questions around that. And so we actually looked at whether you could reprice the options based on various factors in the market. And I know backdating options is one thing that lawyers typically are very, very skeptical of. So it wasn't a look at whether we could backdate them, but what is the actual current value of the option and what makes sense from an equity and value perspective to do. I'd rather not share sort of the confidential decision that we made, but I will tell you, we lined up all of the options that we had with respect to options, and then ways to look at the value of the RSUs and how we handed those out. And I think you get an outside expert in, you have your chief people officer, you have your chief financial officer, and then some creative lawyering solutions. And you really can come up with 3 or 4 valid, doable steps that a company can take. Oh, hello. That a company can take to make sure that their employees are valued and understand what their equity is worth.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Melanie. I think, you're illustrating like 2 different things you can do. One is, you can look at the options and what optionality you have in terms of, changing those options and changing the structure, at least on a one-time basis, before, you move on to next stages. And then you're mentioning the RSUs, which, the difficulty is the tax of it, right? And you don't want to have present tax to employees because that's what makes employees hate it. And you guys, I think, solve that by in a way that's, complex, but used quite often, where you don't fully vest until that trigger event, right?
Right.
Which, then delays the tax liability and keeps people happy, because of course the problem that you're wanting to avoid is taxation without any liquidity, right? Because that's what makes people upset, is they have a taxable event and they've got no liquidity to then pay for that taxable event. And we also had some similar issues, and we had a slightly different technique for it. And our technique is we mirrored a public company type of plan. So we, for example, have a plan where RSUs vest, and we will withhold to cover a certain number of RSUs, and we purchase those at the 409A price, and then we pay the tax with that money. So it's very much like that's like how it would happen in a public company, right? And we'll get to that in a minute, right? You'd have a withhold to cover, you'd have a public market price, you'd sell at that price, and then you'd go with it. It's a really interesting approach to handling it. It's not, though, for every company, because to do that, you have to think about it from the company's corporate perspective. That means that we're buying back our own shares, and we have to have capital to buy back our own shares. And a lot of companies don't have that. They just don't have that ability. Cash is scarce, you're growing, you got to use it for the growth of the company, or you got to use it to make the company stretch out longer. You just can't really do that. Yet once you put one of these plans like I talked about in place, it's great for employees, but you do have to make sure your finance team and, frankly, your founders and your leaders are committed to making sure that cash is always there, because otherwise you don't have a way to bridge employees and make sure that they can have that nice bridge of coverage in there. So I think that there's pluses and negatives of it, whichever kind of way you go, which I think kind of emphasizes the need to really have a stakeholder group that helps with all of that.
Jamey, it's a great point too about looking at tax implications in a global company, a private company especially, because what might work or one thinks works in the US or Canada for a global population creates all kinds of, we call it dry tax issues. And having preconceived notions of how the tax will work for somebody in Singapore or Hong Kong, it's just not the same as it is in the US. And so again, in terms of looking to the left and right across your leadership team and getting advance notice of how this wonderful structure that you've thought up that's going to motivate everybody can actually end up hitting your balance sheet if you're committing to pay the dry tax for your employees is a key initial step.
Yeah, it's a great point, Tricia. I'm glad you brought up the international point, because I think that adds a different layer of complexity, where when when I first started looking at international aspects, I thought, well, it just works the same. You just issue them, the same thing you issue everybody, and that just couldn't be like more wrong, right? Like you have to look at every single country. Otherwise, you're really doing a disservice to your employees. And I don't know if you have any suggestions for how to structure stuff that you might want to share, Tricia, like, profits, interest or anything like that, but it'd be interesting to hear that too.
Sure. And I will, somebody asked the question, Jamey and Melanie, for experience in a PE context, common practices with buying back shares in a private company. I'll share that, for example, at Vantage, we issue something like a profit interest unit, and the vesting of that unit depends on, and the structure of that unit, candidly, depends on where you live. In the US, it's a straight kind of 4-year vest situation. Somebody that we might provide some suggestions about filing an 83B election, for example. On the other hand, for example, when we first, this is, by the way, don't do as I did, do as I say. When we first started issuing shares or units in Singapore, we did it wrong, and we were kind of surprised with the dry tax that hit our employees that we have committed to pay, and we did that in an effort to alleviate the tax burden for our employees upon a liquidity event. So we kind of did a reverse vesting approach in Singapore, and it was not the appropriate way, because yes, it prevented a bigger tax down the road for them, but the employees didn't understand the value of it. It's too far away, and it was a capital hit to the company. So, and by the way, to answer the question, we didn't buy back shares. We just agreed to pay the dry tax. That was fully our fault because we decided on this nutso structure, and we've had since changed to a more of a phantom unit approach with forward vesting. So again, it's the structure can be different depending specifically on the jurisdiction that you're dealing with.
Yeah, that's
if I could just make a point. Oh, I'm sorry, Jamey.
No, go ahead. You jump in.
As you were walking through both examples there, it struck me as we're saying, this can be the case in public companies too, right? There is a country to country specific way that tax is managed on RSUs and options, and this role I have now is global, and we see it a lot for our executives where they're going for their own personal tax advice and coming to us then to make sure that it matches how the corporation is going to give out the equity and what our position would be. Because if you don't match up what we think we're going to do and claim from a corporate perspective with any public filings that could happen, the actual executive could end up with maybe not a burden that they weren't expecting, but certainly some tax questions. Because if we issue the equity here and that's a public filing and they're in a different country and making some sort of foreign tax credit or different tax planning issue, that can come back to bite them and potentially us if we haven't worked that through together.
Yeah, it's a great point, Melanie. And actually, I'm going to use your point as our segue, because you're talking about public companies as well and how that's a problem there. And that's, I think, where we wanted to kind of go next, was to talk about the next stage of evolution, which is when you then now merge to the public company sector. And it's interesting. I think all three of us had a similar experience here, where in a lot of ways, public company equity seemed a lot simpler, in the sense that, there's an established way of doing it. You have your options have become less popular, although still can be used. So you have your restricted stock, you issue your restricted stock. If you want to know how much to issue an executive, you look at your comparables, and it's probably somewhere the 100 to 200,000, and you pick a number. And it was, I think, really shocking to me how there's a box in public companies, and yet in private there's really not. And it just, in a lot of ways, seemed like simpler. It's not simpler, I think, in the sense of, oh, there's CDNA, there's a lot of filings, there's proxies, there's tons of things around that. But like structurally, it's pretty much, you've got like there's a routine and you follow the routine. wonder if you guys maybe might want to add in on kind of your feeling there too, because going from public to private, that was the biggest thing that's
the best part I think about being public and issuing equity is the ability to have some decent benchmarking and some decent transparency, right? And especially with executives filing their Form 4s and 3s about their grants, it kind of lends to transparency across the whole employee population, which is a benefit, I think, because not only when from an employee morale perspective of, oh, this is actually a pretty decent sized grant because, Susie, the CEO, just got 2x what I did, and that feels about right. So that's helpful. But also in terms of when issuing, understanding how much to issue Susie, and whether that's market appropriate, whether that's going to convince Susie to come to join the company, and whether there's some sort of equity in terms of the grants that are being made across the organization, especially in a private company where somebody may have been in the business, like Melanie, when you were at Thumbtack, somebody who joined day one might have a bajillion dollars worth of equity that's not liquid. And so how do you manage that when you're giving additional grants to a newer joiner? I think it's it's a nice benefit.
Yeah, I would have said the exact same thing on the benchmarking. I think the benchmarking and the peer group analyses that we get from our compensation advisors in a public company is worth gold. I find that you may argue with your team or your comp advisor or even your board about who should be in the peer group, but that is a much, much easier conversation to have that can be backed and decided by data than it is at a private company where Bob may just say, oh, not you, Bob, sorry, but like a Bob on a private company board may say, oh, I heard at Airbnb, they're doing A, B, and C, or I heard at, this particular company, they're doing this thing or whatnot. And they have all these anecdotes that if that was data, you could make some good decisions about it. But unless you have a real tie-in to an executive there who's willing to share those anecdotes as data or not, it doesn't do you much good, and you can churn and burn a lot of time trying to get the facts. So I love the benchmarking, the peer groups, the metrics that you set up, and then actually holding yourself accountable, right? It does drive consistency, because I found in a private company, if you were hiring someone in a critically needed position, you may have decided what range you were willing to make the offer for equity, but in the heat of the moment, and you needed to close the deal, you might throw a little more equity at them, which created inequitable equity with your already employed executives. So I could not agree with you more, Tricia. That's what makes it nice on the public company side.
Yeah, and Jamey, what have you what have been your strategies also transitioning from public to private in terms of transparency and benchmarking?
Yeah, I think the transition is really interesting, right? Because you're used to something that's a little bit more opaque, and then all of a sudden there's a bunch of data and it's difficult to process it. So just really consuming the data, I think, is one process, just getting people used to it, but then really realizing, okay, my peer group is super important. Like, my peer group sets a lot of stuff, and it's hard if I think most companies feel like this. Like, every company feels like there's no good peer set for me. I'm special, and I'm so special that nobody's a good comparison. And I mean, literally everybody says that, right? And it's all true. I mean, we are all unique too as individuals, but that's becomes a really big source of how your board is going to look at comp. And especially in an IPO environment, there can be a lot of pressure to go fast on a lot of things. And then you wind up with a peer group that, has implications on your compensation very, very directly, that nobody appreciated had implications on your compensation, or maybe didn't want to pay enough attention to it at the time. So I think that's one of the things that, in that IPO stretch, I always push really hard to pay attention to your peer group because it matters so much. And especially for founders who are doing this for the first time, or executives who are first time public company CEOs. I mean, there's a tendency to just want to say, yeah, that's something you put in the proxy, lawyers. I don't care about that. And you got to really make sure that they know that, oh, but your board is going to really look at that. And if you're not in those windows, guess what? You're going to be compensated the same as if you are in those windows. So it's a really, I think, interesting boardroom conversation when you start talking about that, for sure.
Jamey, a question came in and from Paulette, who asks, could you talk more about the pain points on profits interest? Did any of your PE firms share the value with holders periodically? And I'll start there. I think the idea of transparency in valuations on the private company side is another tough one, right? Just from the transparency that you always have every single day on the share price moves on a public company. There is, to use an earlier phrase, Jamey, that you used, it's more art than science, I think, sharing the valuation with employees. At Vantage, we have chosen to share updates to the valuation on a yearly basis. And I would say, speaking truthfully, probably 40% of the people who are shared that information understand what that means to them, which is another part of the training equation. And I think the trickiest part is to tie what an employee does, what their job is, to an increase in that valuation. So in terms of the morale perspective and the training, just saying, yes, here's where we are today. Great news. We've increased X percent, instead of saying, because we've done X, Y, and Z, this has resulted in an increase in the valuation or an increase in the threshold value. That's something that I wish I could say we had done better at. It's a work in progress. Jamey, how do you handle that at Crusoe?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. It's a great issue you raised that you could probably have a whole session on in terms of like how you tie people's awareness to what they do to that, especially in the private context, because in the private context, there's really two ways people measure themselves, right? There's the 409A, which, to varying degrees, I agree, people sort of understand. We actually do that quarterly, and we make it available to all of our employees. So all of our employees can see their 409A. And we, honestly, we do that in part because of the structure that I described earlier, because that is, an easier tax management structure. But also, so employees can see it and, talk to their own tax advisors about what the implications of that are. But I think in a private company, you also don't measure yourself based on 409A. Like nobody really thinks of that as their value, right? It's what I have to tell my accountant, but everybody is like, what'd you raise at the next round, right? And that's kind of where, everyone sort of measures themselves and feels like, okay, we've either done well or, we're not feeling so good about ourselves, or we're flat, based on all of that. And that happens so rarely. There's big chunks of time in between that. So I find that, nobody gets really enthused one way or the other about 409A. Certainly if they understand it and understand that, that it's really more of a way of measuring value from a tax perspective for employees. But man, did they get charged up about, the serious definition. There's a lot of buzz and frankly, a lot of, difficulty to keep it quiet until you should say it, from a PR perspective. But I think that's a real exciting point for a lot of people that they get excited about. And I think there's also an informational gap where people actually also don't understand the difference between the two. That's always a big point of our education, where we're constantly having to explain the difference between the two, because people only pay attention to the raise value, and they think that's, correlates to their, which is, at certain points, the 409A and that will converge, especially as you get right next to IPO. But until then, they're very different. So that's a big point for us.
Yeah, one thing I'd add to that, because I agree with all of those comments, and when I was in the private company, all of that was new to me, right? I mean, when you're at a public company, you open up your little stock app, and that tells you what the value of the stock is in any given day, right? It's pretty easy math. But one of the things that I thought was so interesting is I just assumed that when you have a 409A, right, and the value hasn't necessarily merged in with what you're raising at or what you had raised at, that is what you would set the value of your RSU at, right, and that is what you would use to make your calculations of giving the equity. And while we had made a plan around how we were going to calculate the RSUs, it wasn't always just what the 409A was. It was often tied to the raised value. And so as you have your ups and downs in the economy and the inputs that go into the 409A, I tried to educate people, and I think Thumbtack did a fabulous job of educating. They did cross-functional education, and I didn't own it by any means. Our chief people officer actually took the lead with the CFO, and I thought it was terrific. It was really hard to explain to folks that a 409A takes a lot of input that really doesn't have to do with the company. Right? There are outside factors and outside companies' activities that are going into that could raise it or lower it. And often we would speak to our advisors about how did you come up with this number next? And what they had chosen to weight in any given period isn't what I maybe would have chosen to weight heavily or what the CFO thought was appropriate. So I think it's just interesting to separate the raise value, the 409A, and then some companies don't use either one to set that value of the RSU.
Yeah, that's a great point, Melanie. It can actually really differ a lot from company to company. And so a lot of different techniques for people to think about using, for sure. Well, let's maybe go back to, because I think we were kind of taking a question. Let's go back to kind of finishing up some of the public company topics, because I think one of the interesting things we didn't get a chance to talk about yet is where is there room for creativity in the public company, context? And I think that for me, that really kind of comes up in the performance shares, which, more and more companies are just required to do as part of, the Glass-Lewis ISS mandates. But it is, an interesting thing throughout the life of a company. And I think it is where you can be a little bit more inventive and bring in different metrics and think about things differently. Melanie, I don't know if you want to start by talking about performance shares a little bit, but that's, I think, something where it gives you less of being stuck in that box.
Yeah, I think it's a great place to try and be creative. And, of course, with ISS and Glass-Lewis, you can only be so creative without expecting some commentary. But I try from a legal perspective to always tell the executives, and I'll even speak to the board about it too, we really shouldn't run our business based on what ISS and Glass-Lewis may say. We have to be aware of it. We have to be able to deal with it. We need to be able to speak to it. But if you can defend the things that you're putting into these plans, I think we have to do what's in the best interest of the company. And the one plan that I helped create that I was most proud of, and then unfortunately I left before I got to reap the benefits of it, is we wrote in a personal performance element to the performance shares. So, 80% of the performance shares were based on company metrics and whatever was relevant for that industry with that peer group and TSR and all of that. But 20% of your performance shares went along with your individual performance in any given year or 2 or 3 year period, depending on how long the period was for them to vest. And that was based on having a new management team that had not been making decisions about budgets and about different decisions on the financial metric side. They had sort of inherited the business and now needed some additional incentives around, if I do the right things for the company now moving forward in my role, can I tie that person's incentives to the company's performance in that way? So I thought it was pretty out of the box. I see it now from time to time, but when we did it 5 years ago or so, it was something that the comp experts were pretty excited to see the results of.
Yeah, I mean, you raised like two really interesting points there. And one is, that yes, you have to know what ISS and Glass Lewis say, but you don't always have to do it. You might need to be prepared for a fight if you don't. But, for example, in one of my companies, we were newly IPO'd. And, when you're a first-year company and you're trying to figure out, okay, what should a 3-year target be when you have no baseline
Right.
that is really, really hard. And frankly, fraught with a lot of potential issues for executive departures if you get it wrong, because nobody wants to have a grant that goes wrong in year, 1 or year 2, because you didn't know, what your numbers were going to be because you're new. And we actually did make some, hard choices with our board that, well, we're just not going to do it the traditional way. And if we have to go explain it to shareholders and win a vote, then we'll just do it that way. But I think that's like one thing that a bunch of, especially newly IPO'd companies forget to think about is, you're setting something up for 3 years, and no executive is going to be happy when, if you don't hit it, because they can just see that part just fall away, and that's a substantial part of their compensation. So Tricia, I think you want to jump in, yeah?
Yeah, just adding in a little bit on stakeholder engagement. I think when you mentioned briefly, the ISS and the Glass Lewis, and whenever I've been working on either a controversial amendment or maybe a performance plan for public company executives, the importance of reaching out and having a consistent engagement approach with your largest stockholders cannot be understated. I think even they just appreciate the overview and the heads up in May or June when you're thinking about the structure. And then again in September or October, assuming you're a fiscal year company, calendar year, fiscal year. And then when it comes time to put something in the proxy for which you need their approval, it's a lot easier to A, get the meeting, and B, get their approval, despite maybe a negative recommendation from ISS or Glass Lewis. And I think the same is true for our PE investors, which we are, I think generally speaking, a lot more closely aligned with and a lot more open lines of communication. But to use my phrase from before, you communicate with me too much, said no stockholder ever. So.
Right. And it is such it's a great point you raised too about the timing of it, because there's nothing worse than having, approved something and you knew it was going to be controversial and you didn't talk to anybody, and now you've got to convince them, as opposed to, just no one likes that in general. But, especially if it's one of your big shareholders, it's just such a good advantage to talk to them before. But it's a really, really great thought.
Yeah, one thing on that, Jamey, if I could, it just goes back, and I'm a big believer in cross-functional collaboration. In these in-house roles, it's often being a good leader that distinguishes you. Lots of good lawyers are out there, but if you can be a good leader and reach across the aisle, I think that's where you can distinguish yourself. And bringing IR into the room when you're developing these plans, or you have this option or that option, and having the IR team do a little digging into, have your shareholders voted on these issues before? Have they seen this at other companies? Even if you're in a private company, taking the pulse of some of your PE investors and saying, have you seen this structure? What do you think about it? You don't want them to sort of have a chance to dive into management and necessarily control the decision, but I do think they appreciate being communicated with early and often, and IR in a public company sense can really help you do that.
That's super helpful. Well,
Jamey, a question came in that I'd love for you to answer. The question is, when you a private equity held company, how do you calculate your total compensation given the illiquid equity part? And here's the important part that I think you can provide some color on, which is particularly when you try to change jobs and the next potential employer asks you about your current pay.
Yeah. Well, I know I always, this is one place where I never use the 409A, right? Because that's just a tax device. And what's that worth? Well, to me, it's the last raise number. Like that's exactly how I'll calculate it. But my last raise number, what I expect it to be. And then I think, the place where, certainly it's not something you communicate, but when you're thinking about changing a job and you're thinking about private company compensation, what you really should be thinking about is trajectory, right? So, if I look at, you might want to look at, for example, your company's, trajectory, like where are those shares going to be worth and what's the rate of growth on it? And if I look at my next opportunity, is it the same rate of growth? Because they might be worth more at the beginning, but if the growth is a 2 to 3% trajectory versus being in a high growth company where your company is growing and doubling, year over year, then you could be better off, staying or going. But that's like, it's a complicated calculus, right? Because you really have to think about growth and not just your growth rate, but your next company's growth rate. And that really requires you to answer a ton of questions. I'm sorry, not answer, but ask a ton of questions from your new employer. Where, like, how often is the company doubling? Are we going to be 4x next year? Are we going to be 2x next year? Are we going to grow 10% next year? It's just that's where the math and being a little bit of your own CFO becomes really important, because it is your career. And, you really have to think about what is best for your career long term. That would be my suggestion for that, but I don't know if you guys want to add in too.
Well, the best
I
part
would
is
just echo. Oh, go ahead.
no
Tricia.
answer. Go ahead. I was just gonna say the best part is nobody can prove it. So
So true.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Melanie.
No, I agree with what Jamey said. And in fact, having just recently 9 months ago gone from private company to public company, I actually called Jamey and said, help me think through this, because I want to be fair, right? Nobody's looking to get one over on the new employer. At the same time, there are so many dynamics in your private company equity that it isn't a straight apples to apples the same way that it is in a public company. So I'll just share one little thing that I did that I think landed us in a very favorable position. The company felt like they had some evidence of what I was saying, and I felt like they had treated me fairly. I did a range, right? I shared with them what the last raise value had been, and I told them that that's what I was calculating my equity to be worth, right? And I explained why. I was pretty forthcoming about why I felt very confident in that number. I shared with them the 409A value because, frankly, there wasn't much spread at that time because they were pretty far along in the stage. But I then said, here's what I think would be a fair assessment of my current equity replacement value. And they came in and did not lowball me on that. They did not give me my top end, but we got to a place that felt fair to both of us. And to me, going in, knowing they heard me and valued me and trusted me, felt good to me. And them knowing I wasn't saying it's apples to apples, it has to be $10 a share or nothing, felt good to them. And I think I maybe got a little bit more by being transparent and sharing the process I was thinking through.
Yeah, I love that that example, Melanie, because it kind of goes back to, general counsel first principles. How do you establish trust, and how do you establish trust quickly, and the value of it in your day-to-day role. And but you also raise like a really good point about, the last raise is only as good as, the time that it was done. There can be a lot of time since the last raise, and that can be a number that, you can argue goes up or goes down. But you're gonna have to make some really reasonable arguments, which I think is, really a great point to make for people. All right, well, I think we're getting close to the end of the time, so I do want to pause for just a second and invite anyone who has questions to kind of start throwing those in now, so that we can make sure we have time to address, everyone's questions. In terms of additional topics, I thought one of the things we might touch on quickly is liquidity at the private company level. So liquidity, is pretty, I think, set at the public company level, right? Again, there's a box there for that. Everybody knows the box, and there's a public market, so it's great. You can sell into the public market at that price, and you have your 10b5-1 plans. But in private companies, there you do have opportunities from time to time to create secondary sales or tender offers, and I think those can be really great for employees, but they're also things to be very cautious about. So, for example, I think one tender offer difficulty that people so often forget is to loop in your audit firm, because audit firms often have very, very specific requirements about how they want you to do that, what it's okay for you to be involved in, what it's not okay for you to be involved in. That's a very easily forgotten thing. And then I think another really good just practice tip on that is, think about who your purchaser is, and do you really want that to be a big group? I mean, can you have a big group? Sure. Theoretically, you can. Is that a process that's easy to manage and efficient? Not really. And you're dealing with employees and employees getting their money. So I think you really want to think about designing a process that gets you enough shares, to have a good process, but doesn't overcomplicate it as well, because that makes it really challenging for employees to understand. Melanie or Tricia, I don't know if you guys want to jump in on liquidity at the private level and add anything there.
Sure. I think it's especially when, as a business, you're looking at an exit horizon that is either non-existent, i.e., no, we're not going to IPO in a year, or we're not going to look for a complete change of control. For example, if your company's too big, or there just really aren't any strategic buyers, and the horizon for a liquidity event can be a real point of contention for employees who have joined with the express purpose of making some money off of their LTIP plans. And I think the creativity from the finance, corp dev teams, capital markets teams, to come up with strategic opportunities to gain some liquidity short of an exit event, a full exit event, is critical to retaining some of those employees. And we have a question. So Melanie, after you provide your feedback, I'd love to ask this of both you and Jamey.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I agree. I think it's very important to be creative there. I know that when you're looking at these tender opportunities, and there's lots of firms now who will just reach out to your employees and they're trying to buy up their shares. I think from a legal perspective, I'll just give that answer rather than a leader perspective or an employee perspective. I think it's very important to maintain control over the cap table. And Jamey, you talking about wanting to know who's in the group and not wanting the group to be too big. You also want to make sure there isn't one firm that's buying up individually these shares and having a cap table adverse reaction that sneaks up on you, right? You can monitor that as the shares go and as the asks are being thrown out there. So I would say from a legal hat perspective, just be sure to be aware of those events.
Absolutely. And without blue sky compliance, which a lot of those firms that buy them up don't necessarily do, or sometimes they do, but it's, I think that's one of the real difficulties that you face, especially as you start to become a later stage company, that really your employees really do become a target for that. And having, certain company-led events that frankly treat them more fairly, I think is a really important leadership thing to think about, and how you orchestrate. And Tricia, you said there's a question.
So this is probably, we have time for this question, and maybe that's it. So Mike asks, at hire, do you try to negotiate for a longer post-termination exercise period for vested options at exit? If not, is it market to get this in your exit package? And if so, what length of time? I'll hand it over to both you and Melanie to
Yeah, I mean, I would say most HR and legal teams would say the plan is the plan is the plan. All employees get the same plan. I want you in the boat with all my employees, and I'm not really interested in your creative ideas because I want all employees in the same boat. I mean, I applaud the creativity, but I would say no. It's just not at all, and won't be necessarily, received.
I completely agree with that. And in fact, have said that when people have tried to negotiate it, in the plan is the plan. But I think what you can do instead for yourself is try to negotiate your incoming grant in RSUs. I try to get as many of those initial grants in RSUs as possible, because then you're not working or worrying about the option side of it. You're just vesting in a time barred manner.
It's a great suggestion.
Right. Hey, well, thanks so much, Jamey, Tricia, Melanie, for participating today and sharing your insights. Appreciate that greatly. And just for everyone that's attending, we are going to be sending an email to you. Just if you would take a minute to provide some feedback. It's just a 1-minute survey. And obviously, if you have any questions, if there's any way we can be helpful, any coaching, recruiting for in-house counsel, or compliance that we could be assistance with, please reach out to any of us here. And thank you again for participating. Look forward to having you join us on future GC Advantage webinars. Have a wonderful day.